In the 1950s, Venezuela was a nation of immense wealth and promise. With a per capita income of around $7,400, it ranked as the fourth richest country in the world, just behind the United States, Switzerland, and New Zealand. Its capital, Caracas, was a booming metropolis, home to modern skyscrapers, bustling nightlife, and a growing middle class. Venezuela was the third largest producer of crude oil globally, pumping more than 27 million tons per year, only slightly less than the Soviet Union. At the time, it boasted the highest GDP per capita in Latin America, richer than countries like the United Kingdom and Germany. Fueled by oil wealth, the nation attracted immigrants from Spain, Italy, and Portugal, who came seeking opportunity in what was often called the Saudi Arabia of South America. By all measures, Venezuela stood as a symbol of prosperity, stability, and limitless potential. But today, the reality could not be more tragic. Nearly 82% of Venezuelans now live in poverty, with more than half in extreme poverty, unable to afford even basic food. The country's GDP per capita has collapsed to around $4,000, actually lower than it was in the 1950s. Venezuela has suffered an economic contraction worse than any modern country not at war, with its economy shrinking by more than 75% since 2013. In 2018, inflation reached a staggering 1 million%, destroying savings, salaries, and entire livelihoods overnight. Once a magnet for immigrants, Venezuela is now the source of one of the world's largest refugee crises, with more than 7 million citizens fleeing. Daily life is marked by empty supermarket shelves, severe shortages of medicine, and widespread malnutrition, with 3/4 of the population surviving on less than $1.90 a day. And yet, Venezuela still sits on an estimated $14 trillion worth of natural resources, including the largest proven oil reserves in the world. So, how did a country once so wealthy become one of the poorest on Earth? Centuries before Venezuela became synonymous with oil, its lands were home to rich indigenous cultures. The Caracas built terraced farms, permanent villages, and crafted intricate textiles. Coastal groups like the Caribs thrived on fishing and trade. Life was simple but organized, rooted in self-sufficiency. Everything changed in the late 15th century when Spanish ships arrived. Colonization brought conquest, disease, and a collapse of native populations. For centuries, Venezuela remained a peripheral colony, known more for cacao and coffee than for power. Ordinary people, many enslaved Africans and indigenous laborers, worked plantations, while wealth flowed overseas to Spain. Venezuela's leap into modern history came not with coffee, but with oil. In April 1914, the Zumacada Oitilerney well struck oil at Meni Grande, Lake Maracaibo. At first, it produced only about 264 barrels a day, but it ignited a new era. By the 1920s, the massive blowout at Barroso No. 2 gushed uncontrolled for 9 days, 100,000 barrels daily, signaling to the world that Venezuela sat on immense petroleum riches. Foreign oil companies rushed in. Shell, Gulf, Standard Oil, all carved up concessions. For villagers and farmers, this was the beginning of a social revolution. Rural families abandoned agriculture to take oil jobs where wages were far higher. In the oil fields, a worker's pay could be 10 times greater than from coffee or maize. Children who once helped plant maize or harvest crops could now aspire to urban life with education and modern comforts. By the 1920s, Venezuela emerged as the world's leading oil exporter. Caracas, once a quiet colonial city, transformed almost overnight. Dirt roads became wide boulevards, nightclubs, cinemas, and department stores sprang up, filled with imported American cars, Scotch whiskey, and French perfumes. For many Venezuelans, life improved dramatically. Teachers, factory workers, and clerks could afford homes, automobiles, and vacations. The middle class expanded alongside an influx of immigrants. Thousands of Spaniards, Portuguese, and Italians arrived, fleeing post-war hardship in Europe. They opened bakeries, cafes, and small businesses, adding skills, commerce, and culture to Venezuelan cities. Caracas became cosmopolitan, its streets alive with jazz, literature, and art, a hub rivaling Miami, Paris, or Buenos Aires in wealth and modernity. By the early 1940s, Venezuela was producing more than 27 million tons of crude per year, making it the third largest producer globally, just behind the USSR and the US. The oil economy was booming, but foreign firms reaped most of the profits. That began to change under President Isaias Medina Angarita, who introduced the hydrocarbons law in the early 1940s, forcing companies into a 50-50 profit-sharing agreement with the state. The government also required that at least 10% of crude be refined domestically and raised royalties. These reforms became the backbone of Venezuelan oil policy for decades. Roads, schools, universities, hospitals, and modern housing for oil workers transformed the urban landscape. Caracas became not just wealthy but culturally vibrant. By the late 1940s, revenues had increased 358%, and oil workers enjoyed some of the highest wages in Latin America. World War II further elevated Venezuela's global role. Though officially neutral, its oil-fueled Allied efforts and production surged. Revenues skyrocketed, enabling ambitious modernization without heavy foreign debt. Ordinary citizens benefited from free public education, healthcare expansion, and urban amenities. By the 1950s, Venezuela's GDP per capita reached over $7,400, making it the fourth-richest country in the world, behind only the US, Switzerland, and New Zealand. In Latin America, it was unrivaled, but this prosperity rested almost entirely on oil. By the 1960s, a visionary minister, Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, recognized the danger of fluctuating oil prices. He co-founded OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, alongside Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait, aiming to stabilize prices and prevent exploitation by Western oil majors. While oil diplomacy promised stability, Venezuela's wealth coexisted with political turmoil. Coups in 1945 and 1948, followed by the authoritarian rule of Marcos Pérez Jiménez, revealed how fragile the country's institutions were. Authoritarianism and weak governance amplified mismanagement and corruption, creating long-term vulnerabilities even during periods of oil prosperity. In 1973, when Arab members of Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries launched the oil embargo, global prices quadrupled. Venezuela's treasury overflowed, government revenues quadrupled, fueling President Carlos Andrés Pérez's La Gran Venezuela. The plan envisioned highways, hydroelectric dams, a steel industry, and vast social spending. Imported goods flooded shops. The state subsidized fuel, food, and transport. Caracas glittered with nightlife, skyscrapers, and a sense that Venezuela had finally arrived on the world stage. Yet beneath the shine, cracks were widening. Almost every bolivar of this prosperity came from oil. Agriculture and industry had shriveled. Corruption seeped into state institutions. Leaders were warned by Pérez Alfonso himself of what he called the devil's excrement. Oil, he said, would eventually poison Venezuela's economy if not managed wisely. By the mid-1970s, the state nationalized the oil industry, creating PDVSA, Petróleo de Venezuela. Overnight, one of the most powerful state oil companies in the world was born. Production stood at 2.3 million barrels a day, and PDVSA soon expanded abroad, buying refineries in the US and Europe. Venezuela's oil wealth was a double-edged sword. Economists call it the oil curse. With every boom, the country grew richer, but with every bust, the economy trembled. Agriculture and manufacturing were neglected, public institutions weakened, and corruption flourished. The state relied almost entirely on oil revenue, leaving Venezuela vulnerable to volatile global prices. What lifted the nation to wealth also sowed the seeds of future instability. Venezuela, with the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, believed its future was secure. Caracas was a cosmopolitan hub. Immigrants kept arriving, and Venezuelans enjoyed some of the world's cheapest fuel and highest living standards. But history had set a trap. The country's prosperity was a house built on oil, an economy dependent on a single volatile commodity, and a state dependent on its revenue. The very wealth that had lifted Venezuela into the world's top tier would later drag it into one of the greatest economic collapses in modern history. By the late 1970s, Venezuela appeared to be living in an oil-fueled paradise. The 1973 oil crisis had sent global oil prices soaring, and as one of the world's top exporters, Venezuela suddenly found itself swimming in cash. It was said that a Caracas businessman could fly to Paris for the weekend, shop at luxury boutiques, and return without denting his wallet. Imported goods flooded the market, from US cars to French perfumes, often cheaper than local products. Consumption, not savings, defined the era, but this prosperity was built on fragile foundations. Oil made up over 90% of export earnings, and almost all government revenue depended on it. When global oil prices collapsed in the early 1980s, partly due to a worldwide recession, oversupply from non-OPEC producers like Mexico and the North Sea, and declining demand from energy conservation, the Venezuelan economy was shattered. Suddenly, the easy money dried up. The government, which had borrowed heavily during the boom years to finance its ambitious projects, now faced mounting debt it could no longer pay. Instead of saving in a sovereign wealth fund like Norway, which carefully invested its oil windfalls abroad, Venezuela spent as if the boom would never end. Norway tightened its fiscal rules, invested profits into long-term assets, and built a buffer against future downturns. Venezuela, in contrast, doubled down on debt and imports, making itself dangerously vulnerable to external shocks. The result was devastating. The bolivar, once one of the strongest currencies in Latin America, devalued sharply. Inflation soared, poverty rose. Ordinary people who had once enjoyed cheap imported luxuries suddenly found their salaries worthless. The middle class shrank and resentment grew. By the late 1980s, this economic pain boiled over into politics. President Carlos Andrés Pérez, who had presided over the boom years in the 1970s, returned to power in 1989 with promises of prosperity. Instead, he was forced to implement harsh austerity measures dictated by the International Monetary Fund, cutting subsidies, raising fuel prices, and reducing government spending. The result was the infamous Caracas riots of 1989, when massive protests and looting erupted in Caracas, leaving hundreds dead after military crackdowns. It was a turning point. The oil dream had given way to bitterness and anger. This turmoil opened the door to populist politics. Disillusioned citizens, frustrated with corruption, inequality, and failed austerity, began looking for leaders who promised radical change. Military officers like Hugo Chavez, who attempted a coup in 1992, gained popularity by denouncing the old political elite as corrupt puppets of oil wealth. When Hugo Chavez won the presidency in 1998, he entered office as the voice of the poor and marginalized. Decades of economic inequality, corruption, and failed neoliberal reforms had left Venezuelans disillusioned with traditional parties. Chavez promised a Bolivarian revolution that would redistribute oil wealth, centralize state power, and deliver social justice through free healthcare, subsidized food, and housing projects. For many, he was a savior who finally gave the poor visibility and dignity in national politics. At first, Chavez's model appeared successful. Global oil prices rose dramatically in the early 2000s, giving his government a flood of revenue. Billions were poured into ambitious social programs known as misiones, which expanded literacy, healthcare access, and food subsidies. Poverty rates fell sharply in the mid-2000s, and for a time, Venezuela became a poster child for resource-fueled social welfare. Ordinary citizens who once struggled could suddenly afford subsidized goods, cheap travel, and public services. In some cases, middle and working-class families spent oil money on luxuries or foreign trips, living beyond sustainable means. But the very strength of Chavez's system was also its fatal weakness. Everything depended on oil. Instead of saving surpluses during boom years, as Norway did through its sovereign wealth fund, Venezuela spent nearly all of its oil windfalls immediately. The country failed to diversify its economy into manufacturing, agriculture, or technology. As a result, Venezuela became even more vulnerable to fluctuations in oil prices. When oil prices began to fall in the late 2000s and early 2010s, the cracks widened. The government had borrowed heavily to maintain social spending, and falling revenues made debt repayment difficult. Subsidies became unsustainable, public services deteriorated, and shortages of basic goods appeared. Inflation surged, eroding the purchasing power of ordinary Venezuelans who had briefly tasted prosperity. Chavez's governance style deepened the crisis by centralizing control in the presidency and politicizing institutions. He weakened checks and balances that might have curbed mismanagement. Corruption spread as billions in oil revenue were funneled through opaque state channels. Critics were sidelined, and the state-owned oil company PDVSA was purged of technical experts, replaced by loyalists. Oil production efficiency collapsed, further reducing revenue. By the time Chavez died in 2013, many Venezuelans had lost faith in the government's promises. The initial gains of the Bolivarian Revolution proved fleeting, as the foundations were built on unsustainable oil dependency. The dream of equality gave way to economic collapse, leaving millions poorer than before. The sharp decline in GDP and living standards marked not only an economic failure but also a collapse of trust between the state and its citizens, a legacy that continues to shape Venezuela today. When Hugo Chavez died in 2013, his successor, Nicolas Maduro, inherited not just power, but an economy that was dangerously dependent on oil. At first, Maduro promised to continue Chavez's Bolivarian revolution, but oil prices soon collapsed again. From over $100 a barrel in 2014, crude dropped below $40 within 2 years. For Venezuela, which relied on oil for more than 95% of its export earnings, this was catastrophic. Instead of adjusting, the government printed money to cover spending. That triggered one of the worst hyperinflation crises in modern history. Prices doubled every few weeks. By 2018, the inflation rate hit an unimaginable 1 million %. Ordinary Venezuelans saw their life savings wiped out. Their salaries could barely buy a single carton of eggs. Government policies only made things worse. Strict price controls created massive shortages. Shelves emptied in supermarkets. Lines stretched for hours outside bakeries. At the same time, currency controls destroyed business confidence and fueled black markets. As poverty deepened, Venezuela's middle class disappeared almost overnight. Families who once traveled to Miami or Paris during the oil boom now struggled to buy basic food. A 2022 UN survey estimated that 3/4 of Venezuelans live in extreme poverty, unable to cover basic daily needs. The collapse also devastated public services. Hospitals ran out of medicine, doctors left the country. Once celebrated schools lost teachers. Malnutrition among children surged. What had been South America's richest nation now faced a humanitarian crisis on par with war zones. This crisis spilled across borders. More than 7 million Venezuelans fled, one of the largest refugee movements in modern history. Colombia, Peru, Brazil, and even the United States absorbed millions, reshaping regional politics. Colombia alone hosts more than 2 million Venezuelans, straining public services, schools, and healthcare systems. These migration flows have reshaped labor markets, politics, and public policy in neighboring countries. Internationally, relations soured. The United States imposed sanctions, accusing Maduro of corruption and election fraud. Years of underinvestment, mismanagement, and sanctions left its oil fields decaying. For ordinary Venezuelans, life today remains a struggle. Power blackouts are frequent. Public transport is unreliable. The local currency, the bolivar, has been replaced by US dollars in many cities, but inequality is staggering. A small elite still lives comfortably, while millions survive on remittances from relatives abroad. Inside the country, daily life grew harsher. More than 80% of Venezuelans lived in poverty. Inflation wiped out savings. Wages became meaningless. Even a doctor's monthly salary often couldn't buy a carton of egg. Still, Maduro held onto power through a mix of military support, fractured opposition, and international allies. Even as GDP shrank by over 75% since 2013, his government claimed recovery. From 2023 to 2025, Venezuela saw small signs of stabilization. Oil output ticked up slightly as some sanctions eased, and the government allowed limited use of US dollars to circulate. This dollarization gave wealthier Venezuelans some breathing room, but the majority remained trapped in poverty. The divide grew sharper, a tiny elite spending in dollars while millions still struggled for basic food and medicine. As of 2025, Venezuela remains at a crossroads. Oil dependency continues, trust in government is broken, and while the country has the world's largest oil reserves, its people are among the poorest in Latin America. Venezuela's decline serves as a stark warning for resource-rich nations. Its dependence on oil created a classic case of the Dutch disease, where other sectors, agriculture, manufacturing, and small businesses, shrivel under the weight of a single booming commodity. Excessive borrowing during oil booms, coupled with corruption and economic mismanagement, left the country highly exposed to global price shocks. In contrast, countries like Norway have transformed oil wealth into long-term stability through sovereign wealth funds, careful fiscal management, and strong institutions. Singapore, with virtually no natural resources, achieved prosperity through trade, innovation, and strategic planning. Meanwhile, Zimbabwe demonstrates the opposite extreme. Resource mismanagement and political instability turned potential wealth into one of the world's deepest economic crises. For a closer look at these examples, you can explore our published videos on Norway, Singapore, and Zimbabwe on our channel. Venezuela's story is not just a national tragedy, it is a global warning on how resource dependence, poor policy, and weak institutions shape the fate of nations.